Today's daf is Lamed Beis, and we'll start with the Mishnah on daf Lamed Aleph, Amid Beis. And the Mishnah tells us, Misha Nadar ben Nazir v'nishal Chacham. So the Chacham, let's say, is going to determine whether his Kabbalas Nazirus was valid or not. V'asaro, and in fact, the Chacham in this case validated his Nazirus. Then Mona Misha Nadar. And there's a big chiddush here in this Mishnah. The Gemara is going to analyze this, that he can start counting his Nazirus from the moment that he accepted his Nazirus, which is a valid Kabbalas Nazirus, even though in the meantime he has been violating his Nazirus, he's been drinking wine, etc. Nishal Chacham v'tiro, if the Chacham says that this was not a valid Kabbalas Nazirus, v'hoisalo behema mufreshes, and he had designated an animal for his korban. And again, he didn't designate specifically that it would be for a chatos, is teitzei v'tira be'eder. And therefore it's chulin because his Nazirus was not chal at all, as the Chacham determined that his Kabbalas Nazirus was not valid. Amru Beis Hillel leBeit Shammai. Beis Hillel are now talking to Beit Shammai about the case in the previous Mishnah that we discussed yesterday on Daf Lamed Aleph, Amid Aleph, regarding Shar Shachar, and we had a machlokus there between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai, recorded in that Mishnah. Beit Shammai hold that the Shar Lavan is Hegdesh, and Beis Hillel say it's not Hegdesh because it's Hegdesh B'tos. So Amru Beis Hillel Beit Shammai here in our Mishnah, Iatem Modim Shu Hegdesh Tos and Sheteitze V'tir B'Eder. Here, in this case, where the Chacham was matir is neder, and he had been mafresh a korban, thinking that his Nazirus was really valid. Now he finds out his Nazirus was not valid, and we're going to cancel that korban, and the Hegdesh is not chal. You see clearly, and presumably Beit Shammai would concede that Hegdesh B'tos lav shmei Hegdesh. So how can you tell me that when he was Magdish a Shar Shachar, the Hegdesh is Chal and a Shar Lavan? Amar lahem Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai respond to Beis Hillel's argument, and they counter by saying that Iatem Modim B'mi. Now we're talking about somebody who was Mafresh Maser Behema V'tah, and he made a mistake. V'karl Chi, when the ninth animal came out of the corral, he called it Asiri, or Lasiri Chi, he called the animal that was really the Asiri, called it Chi, Uliachadasar, and for the 11th animal, he called it Asiri. In all these cases, Shu Mekudosh. And the Kedushas Maser is Chal on the Behema, which he called mistakenly the Asiri, even though it was really the Chi or the Achadasar. And the very fact that he called it Asiri means it's Kadosh, it has Hegdesh of Kedushas Maser Behema, and it has to be brought to the Mizbeach. So you see clearly that even a Hegdesh B'tos is a valid Hegdesh. Amru lahem Beis Hillel respond to that argument by saying, Lo Hashevet Kitcho, you think that the Kedusha is automatically chal in this animal as soon as he designates it, even if he does so B'tos, and therefore you want to prove from that din that Hegdesh B'tos have a Hegdesh. It's not so. Uma ilu ta'a v'niachas hashevet al shmini v'al shnemasar shema asaklu. Would you argue, therefore, that since Hegdesh B'tos shmei Hegdesh, even if you call the 8th animal the 10th, or the 12th animal the 10th, it would be kadosh b'kedushas maser, and that's not so, because that Hegdesh is not chal at all. So you see that Hegdesh B'tos lav shmei Hegdesh. Ella, you'll ask me, so why is the 9th or the 11th is kadosh? And the answer is kosev, because of a special gzeres hakosev. And the Torah shekidesh asiri, the Torah determines that the animal that he called the asiri, which is not really the asiri, is kadosh with hegdesh. Hu kidesh hachi, and even though he was makadesh and he called the 9th the 10th, and here we start our daf for today. The Esach he called the 11th the 10th. Nevertheless, the Hegdesh is chal, but not because Hegdesh B'tos shmei Hegdesh, but because of Gzeres HaKosuv, and the Gemara B'choros Daf Samach Amid Beis derives this from a pasuk. So we don't draw any conclusions from Gzeres HaKosuv. Because on the contrary, if you were to take and apply the principle of Hegdesh B'Tol Shmei Hegdesh, it should apply even if you call the 8th animal the 10th. Now let's get back to the beginning of our Mishnah. The man violated his Nazirus, and the Chacham now was Oser his Kabbalas Nazirus. And the Mishnah says, Mona Misha Shenadar, which means that during this period of time, he started counting his minion of Yemei Nazirus, and he was violating his Nazirus. And yet, despite that, we're not going to punish him and penalize him and say, well, all those days that you drank wine are not counted and not Ola Minyan Nazirus, but rather he could start counting his minion from the day that he took upon himself the Nazirus, despite the fact that he violated his Nazirus. Mani Mas Nisan, Lo Karab Yosef, Lo Karabanan. This Mishnah that completely nullifies and suspends the law of Knas is against Rabbi Yossi the Chacham, because we're going to prove from the Brisa that both Rabbi Yossi and Chacham agree that there's a Knas. The only question is, how far do we go with this Knas? But fundamentally, there's a Knas, and that's universally accepted. And the days in which he violated his Nazirus are not Ololo Minyan Yomim for Nazirus, not according to Rabbi Yossi and not according to Rabbanan. The Sanya, we learned in a Brisa, Misha Nodavar Nazirus, so a person accepted a long period of Nazirus, let's say 100 days, and he violated his Nazirus during a number of those days. And now he comes to be matir his Nazirus, or to bring his karbanos. Ein nizkaken lo elim kein monoben isur, ki yomim shenoga behen heter. We're not going to be matir his Nazirus. We're not going to receive his karbanos unless he adds to his Nazirus a certain number of days equal to the number of days that he violated these Nazirus. And for example, if, let's say, for 60 days out of the 100 days, he drank yayin, now he comes to the Chacham to be matir his Nazirus, or he wants to bring his karbanos and terminate his Nazirus, we impose a penalty upon him, and he's going to have to finish the 100 days, right? He still has another 40 days of Nazirus based on his Kabbalah, and we're going to impose upon him another 60 days, because as we said before, the first 60 days of the 100, he was drinking wine. So at the end of the day, what's going to happen is that in addition to completing his Nazirus of 100 days, we're going to impose upon him another 60 days of Nazirus, connected the days Shenod ben Heter when he was drinking wine. So we have now a completion of the 60 plus an additional 60, which means 40 plus 60. And that's going to be the Shita of the Tanakama of the Chachamim. So let's go again over the numbers one more time. He accepted upon himself the Nazirus of 100 days. He was drinking wine for 60 days. He comes to the Mata. We tell him, you know what? First, finish your Nazirus. And that's going to be a completion of another 40 days. Plus, add 60 days of additional Nazirus, connected the days that you were Noeg Isur, that you were violating the Isurei Nazirus. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Dayo Shloshim Yom. Rabbi Yossi cuts down the days of the Knas, and that would mean the following. He will complete his Nazirus of 100 days, and then he will observe a Nazirus of 30 days. So that means that he's going to need 40 days to complete his 100, plus 30 days as a separate entity, an entity of Nazirus, all told 70 days extra from the day that he comes in to the Chacham, 70 days. Not like the Chacham who had 100 days. But in any event, we see clearly that both Rabbi Yossi and Rabbanan are imposing a Knas. The Rabbanan impose a Knas of Yomim Shenoga ben Isur, Shenoga ben Heter, whereas Rabbi Yossi has a Knas of Shloshim Yom. So the Gemara says the following. Rabbanon, if you're going to try to reconcile our Mishnah with the Rabbanon, the Tanakama of our Brisa, then Kasha, Naziris Meruba. In the case of 100 days of Naziris, which is called Naziris Meruba, goes beyond the 30, how much more so if he accepted upon himself a Naziris Muetes, our Mishnah cannot in any way be reconciled with the Chachamim, because our Mishnah says that those days that he was Noeg Heter are Olim Lo Leminya Nazirus, according to Rabbanan, Eina Olim Leminya Nazirus. And Rabbi Yossi, Kasha Naziris Muetes. Naziris Muetes is the minimum basic standard Nazirus of 30 days. And our Mishnah is against Rabbi Yossi, because according to our Mishnah, if he was Noeg part of those 30 days and violated his Nazirus, so he was Noeg by him Heter, nevertheless, our Mishnah allows him to complete his Nazirus, and that's the end of the story. And we're going to include and incorporate those days of Noeg ben Heter into the days of Nazirus. According to Rabbi Yossi, in a case of Nazirus Muetes, he's going to have to start his Nazirus all over again and accept upon himself another 30 days of Nazirus. And the Gemara now will reconcile our Mishnah first with Rabbi Yossi and then with the Chachamim. Rabbi Yossi, if you want to, you can reconcile our Mishnah with Rabbi Yossi. Rabbana, you could reconcile our Mishnah with Rabbana. Rabbi Yossi, how can you reconcile our Mishnah with Rabbi Yossi? And the answer is Kan b'Nazirus Meruba, the Kan b'Nazirus Muetes. Our Mishnah is talking about a case of Nazirus Meruba. He was accepted upon himself a long Nazirus. And according to Rabbi Yossi, he's not Soser Akol, he's only Soser the 30-day period. The other days are Ola Leminya Nazirus. And Rabbi Yossi agrees that Dayo b'Shloshim Yom. Vakan, in the Bryce, on the other hand, is Nazirus Muetes. He accepted upon himself a basic minimum Nazirus of 30 days. And then Rabbi Yossi says, we're Soser the entire Nazirus. If you'd like, I can reconcile our Mishnah with the Rabbana. And whether or not it's Nazirus Meruba or Nazirus Muetes, he has to be mashlim all the days that he was Noeg ben Heter. The Mishnah says that he can count from the moment that he took the neder, which at face value seems to indicate that he can count even those days that he was Noeg ben Het and he violated and he drank wine. Lo tema, we shouldn't have the girsa mishash and nazar, meaning that he counts his nazirs from the moment that he took the neder. El ema kim mishash and nazar. And what we're doing is we're adding a chaf, and that means that he has to be Noeg nazirus kim mishash and nazar. He violated his Nazirus. He drank wine during his Nazirus. That's Soser his entire Nazirus. He has to start again all the days of his Nazirus as if he was right now, Makabel on himself Nazirus. And that's Kimi Shosh and Nazar. He points out here in the name of Tosfos that Avalim Noag Miktsas Yimei Iser Kodem Sha'avar V'Shasa Yayin. Let's say that he started his Nazirus by being very meticulous about fulfilling his Nazirus, and X number of days passed until he started being laid back and he started drinking yayin. Certainly, we're not going to discount those days which he observed meticulously as a Nazir. Shari stiras Nazir zuhi rak min rabbanon lo min haTorah, rabbanon kansu rak. So this is only a din of stira d'Rabbanon. On a deraisa level, there's no stiras nazirus here because the chacham is going to be mater is nazirus. But the Rabbanon imposed the knas that he has to observe those days of nazirus that correspond to those days of nazirus that he violated nazirus. The Mishnah teaches us nishal l'chacham v'tiru. And even though he was mafresh a carbon, once the Chacham is matir, is Nazirus, that Karban becomes Chulin. And the Gemara now wants to prove from the logic of Beit Shammai, the din of our Mishnah, how can we derive from that Beis Hillel, as far as Tmura B'tos? Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah mid'Beit Shammai nishma l'Beis Hillel. From the words and the position here, the view expressed by the ruling of Beit Shammai, we can derive conclusions about the understanding and the opinion of Beis Hillel. Lav Amri Beit Shammai shehegdesh b'tos havi hegdesh, which means, as the Gemara concluded on Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Beis in the name of Abaye, that the reasoning of Beit Shammai is that even though he was Magdish a Shor Shachar, and at the end, it didn't turn out that the Shor Shachar came out first, but rather a Lavan came out first. And he, the Noder, says that if he would have known that that would happen, he wouldn't have mentioned the word Shachar. The Hegdesh is Chal on the Lavan. That's how Abaye interpreted Beit Shammai. And that's based on the principle that Hegdesh B'tos, Shmei Hegdesh. Again, it's not a complete tos in the sense we're not forcing the Hegdesh down his throat, but we're accepting that he really had in mind a broader Hegdesh that would include even a Lavan, even though his language is quite indicative of the fact that he was Magdish only a Shachar. Now, let's go back to our Mishnah here on Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Beis. And the case was that he came to the Chacham and he told the Chacham that perhaps his Lashon of Kabbalas Nazirus was not a valid Lashon. And Beit Shammai hold, if the Chacham indeed certifies the fact that that Kabbalas Nazirus was not a valid one, then the animal that he was mafresh, teitze v'tir b'eder, it's chulin, because his Nazirus was not chal at all. He did not have a valid nusach of Kabbalas Nazirus, so that Frash's carbon was betos. And lebeis Hillel nami afal gav di amri tmura betos havi tmura hani mili hecha de is isei leikar hegdesh haval hecha de misaker ikar hegdesh is aker nami tmura. So now we're going to derive a conclusion about Beis Hillel, that even Beis Hillel, even in Hegdesh, where Beis Hillel maintained the position that Hegdesh B'tos Lav Shmei Hegdesh, they would certainly concede in the case of Tmura B'tos Chala, and that's a Gemara in Tmura Daf Yud Zayin that we mentioned yesterday, Tmura Suyeh Kodesh L'Ravos, Tmura B'Shogeg Kibbeh Mezid. And now we're going to limit that halacha. And we're going to say the following, that although Hegdesh B'tos in the case of Tmura is Chal, nevertheless, that's because you have an Ikar Hegdesh. You have the first animal that he was Magdish, and that Hegdesh is still very much alive and active. But in a case where he's giving Oker, the original Hegdesh, or he's establishing the original Hegdesh, in those cases, Hegdesh B'tos Lav Shmei Hegdesh. And we cannot equate them with Tmura. Now he says the following, but what would be in a case where, let's say he was Magdish a Behemah L'Karban, and then he was Memir on that animal to another animal of Chulin, and then he was Shoel L'Chacham on the original Hegdesh of the first animal. And the Chacham was Matirit and declared that it's not a Karban. Then is Akir Nami Tmura. That Akira of the original Hegdesh is going to therefore, willy-nilly, is going to be Oker the Tmura, meaning the Chulin Hegdesh as well, because the Chulin of Hegdesh was dependent upon the first animal. Omar Ma, we learned in the Mishnah, Yatem Modim She'ilu Karlichi, if he would call the ninth animal the Asiri, and if, let's say, he would call the 10th animal the Chi, or if he would call the 11th animal the Asiri, it's Mekudash. And now the Gemara is going to bring a machlokes. Does this apply only in a person who made a mistake, or even a person who was mazid and he did it b'kavana? Itmar. Maser, in the case of Maser Behema, and he called the Asiri the Chi, Rav Nachman Omar, the Meiser, which again he called the Chi the Asiri, is Chal Ta'uso. Only in a case where he made a mistake. He thought it was the Asiri. It was really in truth the Chi. He lost count. And Betos, he called it the Asiri. It's Kodesh. But Velo Kavanasa, but not in a case where he deliberately said and declared that the Chi should be an Asiri. That's amazing. The Hegdesh, the Kedushas Maser Behema would not be Chal on this animal because this Chiddush Din and the Gzeres HaKosuv, which is derived from the Pasuk, V'chol Maser Bokar Utzon, the Rabbis Kol Shu Asiri, that's only in a case of Shogeg, in a case of Tos, but in a case of Mazid, it's not Chal. That's the opinion of Rav Nachman. But we have two Amoraim that disagree. Rav Chizda and Rav Bar Rav Huna Amri, they hold that Ta'uso v'kolshkein kavanoso, that if the Maser Behema is Chal in a case of Tos, then how much more so in a case of Kavana? The Gzeres HaKosuv is that anyone who calls the ninth animal the 10th, the Kedushas Maser Behema is Chal on that animal, not only in a case of Tos. So Rava is now going to object to Rav Nachman from our Mishnah. Amalei Rava Rav Nachman l'didach di amrit ta'uso v'lo kavanaso. According to you, that this halacha, that when he calls the 9th, the 10th, if he did it b'kavana, then the Kedushas Maser is not Chal, is, let's go back to our Mishnah. The Kamri Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, Iatem Modim, I'm going to prove to you that Hegdesh B'tol Shmei Hegdesh, She'ilu Kar L'Chi Asiri L'Asiri Chi L'Chadasar Asiri, is Sheshloshta Mekudoshim. Okay, so what does this mean? Shloshta Mekudoshim. Here he says no, Shehu Mekudosh. Okay. Now, Beis Shammai is trying to prove something about Hegdesh B'tol Shmei Hegdesh, but you're telling me, Rav Nachman, Vishtiku Beis Hillel, Beis Hillel did not respond to the svara of Beit Shammai. Rather, they brought a proof that this whole halacha is a Gzeres HaKosuv, that the behemos, in a case of Enom Smuchos, like for example, in the case of, let's say, animal number 8 or animal number 12, the Kedusha is not Chal. But according to you, Rav Nachman, that the Kedusha is Chal on the Chi only because he called it the Asiri B'tos. Lamer Lahon, why didn't Beis Hillel answer Beit Shammai instead of being Shosek, and they could have rejected the svara of Beit Shammai and said, you don't learn any deed about Hegdesh being Chal B'tos from Meiser that's Chal B'tos, because Ma Meiser Shekein Eno Kodesh B'Kavana. According to Rav Nachman, the Maser, when he calls the 9th to 10th B'Chavana B'Mezid, deliberately and intentionally, is not Chal, according to Rav Nachman. And we don't apply the Gzeres HaKos. We only apply it if he was Koresh Shem B'Tos. And obviously that's because the din is based on Gzeres HaKos. And you can't derive conclusions about Hegdesh being Chal B'Tos from Gzeres HaKos. But Beis Hillel did not respond in that way to Beit Shammai. You see clearly that even if he did it b'kavana, the Meiser would be Chal. And that's against Rav Nachman. The Gemara answers, Rav Shimi Bar Ashi, to defend Rav Nachman, Hainu time at the Lo Amrihon. Why didn't Beis Hillel give that answer to Beit Shammai? And the reason for that is because Beit Shammai never would have accepted such an argument. They would have said to Kal V'chomer, Ma Maser Sheinu Kodesh B'Kavana, if using the logic of the Kal V'chomer as Rav Nachman would have it, that Maser is not Kodesh. When he called deliberately the 9th, the 10th, there's no Chalos Kedushas Maser. And nevertheless, Kodesh B'Tos, if by mistake he called the 9th, the 10th, it would be Chal, is Hegdesh, She Kodesh B'Kavana Lo Kolshken. In the case of Hegdesh, where if he was mechavein to be magdishit, then of course the hegdish is chal. And yet, in the case of toes, we should certainly derive the conclusion based on maaser that the hegdish should be chal b'toes. But Rav Shimi Barashi says velohi. The truth is that this kal v'chomer would not be a kal v'chomer to undermine the svara based Hillel. The hegdish bedaiti demari toli. Hegdish depends upon the das of the bailim of the animal, as the Torah says Vayikra Chav Zayin, ve'ish ki yagdish is beso midaito umikavanoso. Therefore, the hegdish betos is not chal. But only in Masa, there's Xeris HaKosuv, that if he was Korei Shem on the Chi, Asiri, Betos, then the Kedushas Masa is Chal. And that's what Beis Hillel was proving, that if the Pasuk was holding that Hegdish Betos, Shmei Hegdish, like Beit Shammai's argument, then even if it was Eina Smucha and he called the 8th the 10th, or the 12th the 10th, the Kedushas Masa should be Chal. And this leads us to the Mishnah on the bottom of Daf Lamed Beis, which is a Hemshech, a continuation of Nazirus Betos. Misha Nadar ben Nazir. He was makabel on himself Nazirus, and at the moment that he was makabel Nazirus, he had animals, and the animals were healthy and well. They were locked up in a pen. And he took a neder, understanding that these behemos, which are very expensive, are going to be designated as the karbanos of the Siyam Nazirusa. But then, halach, during the days of his Nazirus, Lahavius Veni went to bring the behema and to be magdish them, because he had already in mind earmarked them for behemos of karbanos. Somebody broke into the pen and stole his animals. And now he regrets the fact that he took upon himself Nazirus, because it's going to cost him a lot of money now to go out and buy behemos. And the Mishnah makes the following distinction. It all depends what was the situation at the time that he took the neder, the Nazirus. So let's just try to anticipate the distinction that the Mishnah is about to make. There's a halacha called ein poskim benolad, meaning if after a person takes a neder, a situation arises that did not exist at the time of his neder, then you cannot be matir such a neder with a Pesach. A Pesach means that he was unaware of something that existed at the time of his neder. And therefore, our Mishnah says, if when he took his Nazirus, the animals were alive and well in the corral, then that's called ein poschim b'nolad. Because later on, a situation arose that was not in existence at the time of his Kabbalah's Nazirus, namely that the animals got stolen. And that's called Nolad. That's a new situation. You can't say that, there was some mistake that he took at the time of his neder, because nobody could predict Nolad. So any Nolad li'achar Kabbalah's Nazirus, for example, im ad shelo nignava be'emto nazar, so his Nazirus came before the Geneva, and therefore the Geneva was a Nolad situation. After his Kabbalah's Nazirus, we cannot be poseach with that Nolad. El arei ze nazir. The Nazirus is chal.